Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu diesem Online-Vortrag des LWL-Museums für Archäologie und Kultur in Herne. Ich hoffe, man kann mich gut hören. Ähm, ja, mein Name ist Lisa Menzel. Ich habe als wissenschaftliche Volontärin die aktuelle Sonderausstellung Modern Times, in deren Rahmen der Vortrag heute stattfindet, mitkuratiert und freue mich, dass sich doch so viele zugeschaltet haben. Ja, was erwartet uns im heutigen Vortrag? Es geht um die Schlachtfelder des Ersten Weltkriegs im belgischen Flandern und die heftigen Kämpfe zu der Zeit haben natürlich im Boden und in der Landschaft beträchtliche Spuren hinterlassen. Mithilfe der LiDAR-Technik, das ist eine Technologie, mit der Geländemodelle anhand von Laserscans erstellt werden, können diese Spuren sichtbar gemacht werden. Und besonders spannend wird es dann, wenn man die mit historischen Luftaufnahmen vergleicht. Und das ist genau das Thema, mit dem sich der Vortrag heute beschäftigt und uns einen ganz spannenden Einblick in diese heute unsichtbaren Spuren des Ersten Weltkriegs in Belgien gibt. Ja, so kurz zu unserem Vortragenden. Dr. Birger Stichelbaut ist Wissenschaftler am Archäologischen Institut der Universität Gent in Belgien und forscht schwerpunktmäßig zu beiden Weltkriegen in der Region Flandern. Und seine archäologische Arbeit ist vor allem non-invasiv, also das heißt, es finden keine tatsächlichen Bodeneingriffe statt, sondern eben mittels Fotografie oder eben diesem LiDAR ist das, was seine Arbeit auszeichnet. Er hat auch bereits mehrere Publikationen rund um dieses Thema Konfliktarchäologie, die Weltkriege in Flandern veröffentlicht und ist einer der führenden Köpfe äh, zu diesem Gebiet in Belgien. So, dann ein paar technische Hinweise. Wir haben das so eingestellt, dass die Diskussionsteilnehmer, also die Teilnehmenden, das Video und den Ton nicht anmachen können. Das hilft uns hoffentlich, die Verbindung einigermaßen stabil zu halten. Im Anschluss an den Vortrag wird es eine Diskussions- und Fragerunde geben. Wer Fragen hat, kann die gerne in den F&A-Chat oder einen Chat schreiben und ich leite die weiter, beziehungsweise wenn während des Vortrags schon Fragen sind, können wir die auch gern sofort beantworten. Der Vortrag wird auf Englisch stattfinden, die Fragen können Sie aber gerne auch auf Deutsch stellen. Und genau, ich glaube, das wäre es soweit erstmal. Dann würde ich jetzt mal die Sprache wechseln. So much for a first brief introduction. Birger, I'm sure you could follow. We're very happy to have you. Thank you for being with us today. We're looking forward to your exciting lecture, and I will pass on the word to you now.
Thank you. Everything you said was correct, I think. I understand German. I don't speak German, so that's why I will do it in English. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for you to follow. My name is indeed Birger Stichelbaut. I'm an archaeologist by training. I'm not a field archaeologist. I'm also not a lazy archaeologist, but I'm an archaeologist who doesn't like to work in the field, and I have my own proper tools to study archaeology, to study the archaeological landscape of the First and Second World War in Belgium. And I do this mainly by using historical aerophotographs. And in this presentation, I will talk about the use of First World War aerophotographs for the archaeology of the First World War. They're not only stunningly beautiful pictures, in my opinion, but they're also an underrated and an underutilized source of information for the study of the First World War. If anybody has questions, don't hesitate to ask them, put them in this chat function, and I will try to answer them straight away. We cannot talk about World War I era photography without going a little bit into the history and the history of photography, aerophotography, that cannot be separated from developments in two different domains. And one is photography and the other one is aviation. The history of aviation, we have to think about late 18th century. There have been balloon flights taking place since then. And also the emergence of photography that can be placed in the first half of the 19th century, when the first experiments took place. And both disciplines, photography and aviation, at that time you could speak about aerial photography. They were brought together the first time by Félix Gaspard Tournachon. You can see him in his balloon above France. These photographs have however not been preserved. But this is the start of aerial photography. And from that moment on, people could begin experimenting with aerial photography. Next important step, very important development in aviation, took place in the United States, 1903, when the Wright Flyer made its first historic flight of only 30 seconds near Kitty Hawk in the United States. And from that moment, it was not only possible to use balloons as a camera platform, but from that moment on, also the possibilities for using an aircraft as a camera platform could be explored. However, it would take another 6 more years until 1909, when the first aerial photographs was taken from an airplane. It was again one of the Wright brothers, Wilbur Wright, who received the credits for taking the first aerial photograph from an aircraft. And so you can see that in 1909, both aerial photography and aviation, especially aviation from aircrafts, but still in its infancy. And then over the next 10 years, mainly from 1914 to 1918, there would be incredible steps forwards, both in technology in general, but especially also when it comes to aerial photography, and especially also aviation. So we're at the onset of the First World War. There's a new phase in the history of aerial photography that starts when the war broke out in August 1914. And then very quickly, the mobile warfare quickly turned into a stalemate in the trenches. And the traditional means of gaining intelligence on the enemy, that being the cavalry and the espionage, they failed. And it's the newly born air forces that soon became the new eyes of the military commanders. And already in the early weeks of the conflict, aircrafts were sent out to gather visual information about the enemy. Where was the enemy? What was he doing? Where was his artillery positioned? And in the beginning, they did these observations purely visual. So that means flying, looking with your own eyes, perhaps a binocular, making sketches in an aircraft. But the problem was that these pure visual observations, that they were not always trusted by ground commanders. And pilots and observers, they grew frustrated with the situation and began also to carry out their own private camera gear on board of these aircrafts. And they started to take photographs of the enemy. And soon these sketches, these drawn sketches, they were abandoned in favor of aerial photographs. And within a couple of months, let's say in April, May 1915, this practice became totally professionalized. And at that moment, there was a full professional aerial photography where both sides, both enemies were photographing each other. So the Allies were mainly photographing Germans, Germans mainly photographing the Allies. And they want to know what the other party was doing, where his forces were stationed, where what they were planning, and especially also making maps out of this information. On the slide, you can see an example of such an early aerial photograph. It's Ypres in April 1915. It's just prior to the start of the Second Battle of Ypres. You can see the clouds of smoke rising from the burning city. There's shell holes. There's shell holes everywhere in the landscape, and the cathedral and the Ypres Cloth Hall, they are burning. This is a typical photograph of the beginning of the war. You don't see much devastation. You see the devastation, but it's almost nothing when you look at the end of the war in 1918. I always show this slide to explain why do we use aerial photography. I want to use aerial photography to gain additional insights into the history and the archaeology of the First World War. And we chose to do this by using aerophotographs. And the main reason can be explained using this photograph. So what do we see? We see a red carpet. It's an ugly red carpet. It's somebody's grandmother's ugly red carpet. We can see a lot of detail. It's like where a cat or a baby is sitting on this carpet. We can see a lot of detail. We can see dust. We can see that it needs to be vacuum cleaned. We can see the texture of the textile. We can see spots of color, but that's it. We get a lot of detail. We don't get any oversight. So if you change your perspective, if you take an aerial perspective of this carpet, then we can see why we want to use aerophotography. We can still see that it's a carpet. We have a more distant perspective. We're looking top down. And now we also see the design of the carpet. We can see the relationship between the green lines, the yellow dots, the white dots. And we can see the design as it was meant to be seen from the air. And it's a holistic overview perspective. It's panoramic perspective from a distance that we're after. And this is what we're trying to do with the aerophotography. We're not so much interested in the detail, but we're after the oversight. So let's change the carpet for a ground photograph of the Yper salient and taken in the Yper salient. It's a photograph taken on a famous spot in the Yper salient near the Bellewaarde theme park. It's taken at the Mennen Road, an infamous road from Yper to Mennen. And we're looking at a tank cemetery. We can see the remains of 1, 2, 3, 4 tanks. We can see, I will show one tank over here, a second one, there's a third one in the distance, and a fourth one here. We can see these stumps of trees in the distance. This was once a wood. You see a man walking in the distance, and we can see all these features. These are all shell holes filled with water. It's a male cannon, a male tank. That's something that we can see. And the photograph is taken from a higher point, and it was taken towards the south. That's something that we can see by looking at the shadows. If you change the perspective, and now I have to go to the next slide. If you change the perspective, we're looking at the same exact landscape, the exact same spot where that ground photograph was taken. However, because of the distance, it's not easy to see them. If you look carefully, you can see the tanks. You don't see 4 of them. You can at least see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. And to the north, there are a couple of more. And because of the aerial perspective, you get this overview perspective. You get to see the street, the Mennen Road. You can see mine crater at the center. You can see the tanks, but you can also suddenly see trenches that were dug into this landscape. So the photograph adds information that we don't have from the ground photograph. And additionally, it's possible to locate this photograph. We can not only locate this photograph, but we can now also locate the trenches, the tanks, and by locating it in the landscape, it's possible to go on the terrain, go to this spot, and also know where the archaeology of this conflict landscape might be preserved. So I'll zoom in a little bit. This was the spot over here where the photograph was taken. Photograph, that's the 1 tank, 2 tank, 3 tanks. Photograph was taken here. So here you can see a perspective, a different perspective between the ground and the air. And I'm in favor of the aerial perspective. Of course, otherwise I wouldn't be giving a presentation about World War I aerial photography. If you want to use aerial photographs, we have to delve in archives. We have to find aerial photographs. And I've spent a lot of time in archives all over the world. I was interested in finding out where major collections of First World War aerial photographs were located. And quickly, I thought, and in the beginning, I thought we were dealing with hundreds of photographs, thousands of photographs, but it soon turned out that we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of photographs that are still preserved in archives all over the world. So the largest archive, it's a German archive. The Bayerisches Hauptstaatsarchiv in Munich, they have a collection of 300,000 printed paper aerial photographs, so prints of printed aerial photographs. It's a collection which is not very well accessible, but by any means, it's the largest known collection of aerial photographs taken of still existing. Other large collections of other German armies, they were mostly destroyed during the Second World War. And now we have the Imperial War Museum's collection. They have 133,000 glass plates, glass plate negatives that are preserved. In Belgium, Royal Army Museum in Brussels, we have a small collection of 50,000 photographs. And then there are minor collections in Australia, in Canberra, the Australian War Memorial, and also in the US, the National Archives and Record Administration in Washington, D.C., they have a smaller collection of 16,000 aerial photographs. So if you do the quick math, there's almost 500,000 of those photographs that are still preserved and accessible in archives today. The best introduction to the theme of aerial photography is quickly showing a couple of these images first. Many of you will visit Ypres in the coming days. I've selected an aerial photograph of Ypres. When you come to Ypres, you will drive in Ypres through the Menin Gate. The Menin Gate is located in this spot over here. And we see the devastated town of Ypres. There's almost not a single building that was untouched by the artillery. And also on the photograph, you can see a lot of metadata. We can see that it's a photograph taken by the 10th Squadron B flight. The serial number of the photograph is 365. It's a photograph taken in map sheet 28I8, so we're able to locate these photographs. The photograph was taken on the 8th of May, 1918 at 5:30 in the afternoon. And then you also have the north arrow showing the north. If we zoom in, we can see the detail that these photographs give. Each black dot is one shell hole. You can see the shadow of the belfry tower of the Ypres Cloth Hall. You can see one big long shadow. Elsewhere in town, you almost don't see any shadows. That means that all of these buildings were destroyed. There's almost nothing to be seen of buildings in the town. Most photographs are vertical. They're taken from above, directed at straight angles downwards. They're the most informative photographs, but they're also the most difficult to read. For laymen, it's easier to use oblique photographs. It's, again, the same spot. We're looking at the Ypres Cloth Hall. Now you can see the devastation in the town. You can see that the remains of the Cloth Hall, that's the place also where the Flanders Fields Museum is located over here. And you can see the remains of the St. Martin's Cathedral that was almost totally destroyed. And the scale of the photographs is sometimes large enough or small enough to show people, soldiers, British soldiers walking into the streets of Ypres. So this is the good spectrum of the photographs. Now you have a German photograph, a photograph, and that's the other spectrum. It's underexposed, overexposed, unsharp. We're looking at the town of Dixmude. This is the other end of the spectrum. It's very bad quality, but this is the kind of photographs that we have to deal with. And then the third photograph that I wanted to show you, it's a high quality photograph, but of a bad quality landscape. It's a German era photograph taken by the Bayerisches Fliegerabteilung 45, taken in the 23rd of November 1917 around noon. And they photographed what once was the Bahnhof, Nordlich Bahnhof Poolkapelle at a height of 700 meters with a 25 centimeter lens. So this is A typical aerophotograph of 1917. 1917, that's the year of the Third Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Passchendaele, where large parts of the landscape were destroyed and looked like this. This is a typical Flemish landscape in the fall of 1918. So this is the kind of photographs that we deal with, the kind of photographs that we try to get information out. I'll show you the next photograph is it's one of my all-time favorite photographs, and not only because I think it's a pretty photograph, it's an artistic photograph, but also because it's a photograph that really shows what is the value of these photographs. And the first thing that struck me were the multiple layers of information that you can see on this one image, and it's a very good example of what kind of information that one person could get out of one single photograph. So what do I mean with different layers? The oldest layer in this landscape is the circular feature. The circle, it's not natural, it's a man-made feature, it's a medieval moated site, it's a motte castle perhaps, it's some kind of medieval castle, a moat with a ditch around it, and it's the archaeological landscape. It's a medieval feature that shows up at the beginning of the 20th century. And that's the oldest part of the landscape. Second layer is the natural landscape. We can see the Iser River. We can see an old meander of that river, and it's a natural landscape. We see the course of this river. The motte castle was placed close to this river for strategic reasons. And then a third layer is the historical landscape. More than any map can do, aerophotographs show us how the landscape looked like at the beginning of the 20th century. We can see villages, streets, towns at that time. We can see historical field boundaries. And then on top of these three layers, not just on top of it, but also in relationship with those three layers, there's the war landscape. In red, I've highlighted all of the, not all of them, but the main trenches. Red are trenches, they're Belgian trenches leading towards no man's land, which is on top of the photograph. German front line is just 500 meters to the north. The trenches are leading inside no man's land. They are going to the archaeological site because it was an elevated feature in the landscape. The trenches were dug next to this river, and they were actually utilizing every part of this landscape. So that's what I mean with the layered landscape. Is one photograph. You might be interested in the war layers of the photograph, but you can also see that it shows a photograph of a layered and richly textured landscape. But then also, when we examine these photographs in detail, we quickly realize that the majority of the features, I quickly go back, the majority of the features that they are trenches, that they are bunkers, shell holes, etc. So they're the more recent nature, and most of them are related to the First World War. And 15, 20 years ago, when these photographs were discovered for the first time, those kind of photographs kept on raising questions about the unique heritage of the First World War. And important questions that were asked were, is the archaeology of the First World War, is it really heritage? Is it archaeological heritage? And how do we treat it? Should every trench be excavated? And how do we make responsible choices? What do we do with the human remains that we encounter? On British side, we know that there are approximately 70,000 British soldiers remaining. On German side, we don't know. On Belgian side, we also don't know. But in general terms, we believe, or we know, or we can estimate that in the former Western Front in Belgium, over 100,000 bodies, skeletons of missing soldiers are still left behind. So that's also an important part of the archaeology. What do we do with it? What do we do with these human remains? Should we search for them? Should we excavate them or not? And what should we do with them afterwards? And in Belgium, France, and UK, the past 20 years, there's been a trend within the professional archaeological community to also deal with these remains of the First World War. And today in Belgium, there's not a single archaeologist that now believes that the heritage of the First World War, that it's not a truly archaeological heritage. We're 20 years later after the First World War, we have the Second World War, and now we're in the same situation. In Belgium, the archaeology of the Second World War, we're dealing with it now, and it's rapidly becoming also mainstream archaeology. So that's what passing of the time does. So what does it do? Conflict archaeology. It gives new layers of information. By excavating human remains, we're not only giving human remains a grave, sometimes we can identify them. The past 20 years, 750 fallen soldiers have been excavated in Belgium. 50-50 British, 50-50 Allied and German. There's only 43 identifications that have been done. And on German side, there's a lot of identifications based on identity discs, because the German ones were mainly made in metal. They preserve quite well, and so we have a number of identifications of soldiers that were excavated. Another layer of information is by excavating trenches, you can get an insight into the daily life in the trenches. For instance, there's a difference between heavily fortified German trenches. They wanted to stay, of course. And then we have lighter British and French constructions. French trenches are always rubbish. Why? Because they have an offensive doctrine and they didn't want to have the soldiers staying too long in the trenches. So that's something that we can detect archaeologically. We can see the evolution of trench warfare by excavating them. And then we can also see the relationship between the natural landscape, between hills, between brooks, between ditches, and the places and the ways that trenches were dug. So it's to this kind of a discipline that I want to contribute. And I want to contribute by using aerophotographs. And I'm interested in aerophotographs. I'm interested in aerophotographs as a source of information, but I'm mainly interested in the information which is visible on the aerophotograph. And that's why I want to locate each and every single of those photographs. So we have a photograph on the left. We're looking for ground control points in red that I want to find on a modern day cadastral map. By using specific geographical information systems, we reposition the photograph, we position it as accurately as possible on the landscape, and the result is something like this, what you get. You have the 1918, 1915 or 16 photograph in black and white on top, and the present day landscape at the bottom. You can see that the street on the left seamlessly connects. It's the same street, it's the same landscape. Instead of trenches, there's now an industrial estate. Here you can see a British military cemetery in between the British front line and the German front line. This is a very distinctive part of the German front line in Ypres. And the British cartographers made fun of it. They called it Caesar's nose, not Cleopatra's nose, but Caesar's nose, because it was a distinctive feature in the German front line. And you can see that the British soldiers and German soldiers, they were barely 20, 30 meters apart from each other in this specific part of the front line. This is something that we do with many photographs. You have the historical photograph. Now we have 3 photographs plotted on a map. I'm over here now. I'm near Gent. You will visit Ypres. Here you have 3 photographs. We indicate the position of these 3 photographs, and again, a geographical information system. We attach a database to this, so we have all the metadata of this photograph attached to it. And then this is what we have of aerophotography. We have a data set of some 22,000 aerophotographs, and the most heavily fought over places of the Western Front, sometimes we have as much as 150 different dates of 1 single square meter in the former Western Front. And it's not overkill. It's because we're interested in the evolution of the front line. We want to have photographs 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18, and if possible, for many months and many weeks of those years. So this is a data set that I have, and it's a data set that we use for scientific research at Ghent University on conflict archaeology. That's something that I will start discussing. Excuse me. And then also we use it for museum applications and multimedia use. And for those of you that will visit the Flanders Fields Museum, we have a multimedia application in the museum and also interactive iPad applications or smartphone applications where you can look at the aerial photographs both in the museum context and in the landscape. So what do we do with the photographs from a scientific point of view? I'm interested also in finding out what's visible on these photographs. And that means that we interpret, we map, and we make a cartographic inventory of all the features that are visible on these photographs. And it's akin to manually tracing each feature on a computer screen. It's mapping, it's digitizing, a lot of hard factory work, a lot of manual labor. And this is an example of how it goes. What you will see on this photograph, on the left, you can see medieval moated site. We can see a house on a moat. There's ditch around it. And through that farmstead, there's a dense German network of trenches. In red, an aerial photographer during the First World War already noted down the location of the barbed wire entanglements. And what I'm doing is exactly the same work that they were doing. I'm mapping and digitizing. I'm extracting the information which is visible on the photograph, and I'm getting it out of the photographs and making new maps of it, maps that we can now start analyzing. So this is just a small example of a couple of hectares of the Western Front in Belgium. So what does this methodology yield? It works on 2 levels. First of all, on a site level. The methodology proved to be very effective on various levels. And the first and smallest level is the level of one individual site. And questions that we can answer with our data set for every square meter in West Flanders include: what happened at that place during the First World War? And what kind of features can we actually expect to find in the archaeological soil archive? For instance, here, we're looking at the black and white topographic map of the 1980s, 1990s in Belgium. We can see this square plot, the square field boundaries. And if we look back, we can find the origin of this field boundary. And it's actually German cemetery, which was built on that spot. We can see the digging of the graves, the black dots. It's an individual grave that's being buried at that time. And German cemeteries are very nice in Flanders because they have quite elaborative landscape architecture. If you compare Allied cemeteries during the First World War, they're purely functional. It's digging holes to bury the dead. On German side, the dead were buried on a smaller level. They were buried by their own regiment. They were buried by their own division. And there was always some kind of a landscape architectural impact to those cemeteries. So they were just like the carpet. It's only when you look at the German cemeteries from the air that you can also appreciate their elaborative design. The cemeteries have disappeared in the 1930s and 1950s. All the German cemeteries, they were, not all of them, but the majority of German cemeteries were concentrated. The bodies were excavated and they were concentrated into 4 large German concentration cemeteries, of which Langemark, which you will probably visit, is one of the most famous examples. So this is an example of one site. By looking at the air photograph, we can not only find out the origin of the field boundary, but we can also indicate that there used to be a German military cemetery at that spot. And by experience, we know that if you will excavate that spot, you will find empty graves, empty because the bodies have been exhumed and buried at the concentration cemetery. But many of the coffins were left behind. And in the coffins, we still find, or archaeologists on the field still find many personal objects that were left behind, and stuff like that. Second example, what does the methodology allow us to do? It allows us to look at the evolution of the landscape. Here we can see Passchendaele. Everybody has heard of Passendale or Passchendaele. It's an infamous place name. There are photograph dates of 1915. At that time, Passchendaele is quite a peaceful village, about 10 kilometers behind the German front line, the German-occupied territory at this time. And then during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, the rain and the relentless artillery bombardments, they transformed the landscape. We shift from 1915 to 1918. You can see the evolution of the front line. You can see the total annihilation of the landscape. Each dot is one single shell hole. I will again spotlight things over here. You can see the German front line. It's nothing more than a couple of water-filled ditches. The remains of the church over here. Some of the streets are still visible. And then if we compare with the situation today, Passchendaele has been rebuilt. It's totally the same village, except for that the people live on a landscape which is filled with non-exploded ordnance, and a landscape in which also many missing soldiers will be located. And you can also see that by looking at the street pattern, you can see that the reconstruction in Flanders, that was quite identical. Villages were built up as identical as possible. Streets were reused. The church was rebuilt on exactly the same spot. So this is Passchendaele today. And then the final level, the third level, and that's my favorite level, is the level of a landscape. And our research area for this part of the presentation is West Flanders, the North Sea, Newport, village of Dixmude, and then Ypres. In blue and red are the main front lines in that period. We utilized some 15,000 World War I era photographs to study that area. And we meticulously mapped over 230,000 features. Every trench, every barrack, every bunker, every barbed wire entanglement, every airfield, aircraft shed, ammunition dump, etc. that we found on the photographs or that we could identify was also mapped. And by doing so, we get an incredible insight into the density, the distribution, and the diversity of war heritage that might or might not be, but mainly is still preserved in the archaeological soil heritage. Of course, this map doesn't make sense to you. It also doesn't make too much sense to me because there's too much information on top of it. If we isolate features, we can see that there were almost 5,000 kilometers of trenches in just the first 60 kilometers of the front line. So you have the front line in Belgium, that's 60 kilometers of front line, and then you have 600 more kilometers of front line in France, up to the border, the French-Swiss border. And in Belgium alone, in the area that we mapped, we detected 4,600 kilometers of trenches. And we know by researching it that almost 80% of the trenches that we still see on an aerial photograph is also preserved in the surface today. So at the top hand right, you can see mechanical excavator, and you can see the trace of this Belgian sinuous communication trench over here. The archaeologists are safely doing their job. The mechanical excavator is helping them, and they are revealing this nice Belgian trench. Close to the trenches, we have shelters. We have shelters. The bottom right, you can see an example of it. Sometimes it's just a couple of wooden deck boards, and then it would be piles of sandbags, and that's what it is. That's the shelter. That's the kind of, it's not all concrete bunkers. No, most of them were these kind of wooden and earthen shelters. There's mine craters, 300 of them, and there's also barbed wire entanglements. More than 2,000 kilometers of barbed wire that we could see. That was a divided landscape that was constructing successive lines of defense. And then also pillboxes, concrete bunkers that were left behind, thousands of them that we can still see. We mapped over 8,000 of them, but it's important to note that only maximum 100 of them still are visible above the ground in Flanders. So many of them have been destroyed, but the majority of them is still there, but buried below the surface. And then other parts of this landscape, of course, World War I is an artillery landscape, an artillery battle, an artillery and industrialized warfare. We have 12,000 gun emplacements, and many of you have perhaps already heard about the iron harvest in Belgium. That's when Belgian farmers get the potatoes out of the soil. It's not all potatoes that they get out. It's also quite tons and tons and tons of live ammunition that still gets found each day, each month, and each year. At top hand right, you can see an example of a Livens projector emplacement. Those are gas canisters that are fired with these kind of a mortar-like tubes. You put a gas canister in that tube, you fire it away, and then you fire a deadly gas cloud on the enemies at the other side of the front line. Ammunition dumps and railways are also a part of this dangerous landscape. Soldiers were not always staying in the trenches. We have found many places where they had their barracks and also tent sites, and also these places are archaeological sites. You can find many places where there are barracks preserved. Sometimes there are only rubbish pits preserved, but in any cases, there's still some kind of material culture to be found in those places. And of course, we have the cemeteries, many of the cemeteries that were disappeared, and I've also already talked about. We also have the problematics of finding many human remains each year. Dozens of human remains are still found, and they're silent witness of the heavy personal losses during the First World War. So if we look at everything together, we can see that we're dealing with a complex landscape. It's a landscape that changes from nature. In the center, we have the front line, we have the trenches, that we have an area with artillery, and then we have the back areas that were used to keep on the war moving. So these kinds of maps not only give us an insight into what can be expected in the soil, but there are also policy supporting instruments that are showing that World War I archaeology is not just the battlefield. It's a huge landscape. The landscape doesn't stop at the end of my research area. The landscape goes on and on and on. In every part of Belgium and also in Germany, you will find archaeology of the First World War. You will have practice trench systems. You will have training centers. You will have prisoner of war camps, etc., etc. And that's all part of this one conflict landscape of the First World War. And this is one approach. By using aerophotographs. We are conceptually working with photographs that gives us an idea of the war landscape during the First World War. We have the advantage of knowing what was there at that spot. We know how many features were constructed, where the trenches were located, but what I don't know is what happened with this along the way. What happened with this heritage the past 100 years, and what still remains of heritage. We can find out, but that's a totally different approach. We start from the present-day landscape, the heritage, and we try to figure out what remains of this landscape. And ideally, those two approaches, they come together. This is the approach which worked best for me. This is the traditional archaeological approach, and I will give you a little bit of insight in this. One technique, again, is aerophotography. Archaeological air prospection is one option, and with small aircrafts, we're taking photographs of sites that are revealed because of differential crop marks in the soils. And how does it work? Well, crop marks, they appear to the principle of differential growth in places where there have been in the past ditches or pits. Plants who grow above them, they get more water, they get more nutrients, and then in times of stress, in times of drought, those plants they have more water and they keep on being more green. So at the time that other plants are dying, those plants are green. And as a result, that's what you see here. So a plant that goes on top of a ditch, they grow higher and they grow greener. And that's what you see here. You can see German practice trench system close to Ghent. You can see over 100 years later, almost 100 years later, you can see the remains of trenches that are preserved below the surface, and you can detect them by looking at the crops that are still growing today. Second example, nice example of a conflict landscape close to Ypres. What immediately you can spot is a pillbox, large German bunker, concrete roof is visible. Then you can also see those features here, the blue lines. Those are trenches, which are, again, you can see the crenulated trace of square traverses. It's a typical British trench. There's another one over here. Over here, you can see a pillbox, which is visible because plants don't grow on top of it. That's what you see here. There's a buried stone feature. There's a shallow or poor soil and the poor crop growth. That's what you get over here. So you have a bunker, which is visible today. We have the shell holes, we have trenches, we have a bunker here. And then all these dots, all these green dots, those are artillery craters, which are still there. And they're filled in, but even 100 years later, we can detect them in a dry summer. It's not always visible. It's only visible in very specific times. And then sometimes the features are still visible on the ground. This is a holiday photograph of a couple of years ago. My children are trained as a conflict archaeologist, and they had to run through this German bunker. It's a German bunker that's revealed because of the crop marks over here. That's a crop mark. The bunker remains are below here, and this is being infilled. So you have a German pillbox, which is revealed almost exactly 100 years after it was built because of plants that grow or don't grow on top of them. That's the first technique, aerophotography. And then Lisa was already referring to it. One of my second favorite techniques is LiDAR. It's called LiDAR, or ALS, airborne LiDAR, airborne laser scanning. It's called laser image detection and ranging, airborne laser scanner, and essentially it's an aircraft equipped with a laser scanner. The laser scanner fires laser beams towards Earth. Those laser beams, they reflect. And by doing all kind of digital wizardly stuff, you can make a digital terrain model, and you can detect archaeological features in a forest. So how does it work? Again, the aircraft fires a laser beam towards the Earth. The laser beam returns, and then you can get an idea of the height of the terrain. Now, if the aircraft flies above a tree or a forest, some of the laser beams, they reflect on the tree canopy. Some of the laser beams reflect on lower branches. And some of the laser beams even can penetrate through the leaf coverage. They can't go through the leaves, but the leaf coverage of a tree is never 100%. So some of the laser beams get between the leaves of the tree. And we can digitally remove the trees and only keep the bare earth. And by doing so, we can get an idea of what's preserved below a tree canopy and what's preserved at the surface. So here's an example. We're looking at Mount Camel, the site of the famous German spring offensive, the Battle of Mount Camel, the Camelschlacht in April 1918. It's a forested region, one of the few forested regions in close to Ypres. We're looking at an aerial photograph draped on top of a digital terrain model. We take away the trees and suddenly we can get an insight below the tree canopy. And what do we see? I can see many features, but we can see a railway bedding over here. We can see British trenches over here, another trench here, and each and any of the black dots over here, all these tiny dots, they're all shell holes that still remain and are still visible. You can see them very good here. It's still faintly visible. They're faint, they're there, but it's almost impossible to see them on the ground. So with LiDAR, we can visualize the minimal height differences on the terrain. And we can really bring to light, literally, using light, those features of the war that are still preserved at the surface. And how do I know that this is a trench and this is a railway? Well, I cheat. I use the aerial photographs of 1917, 1918. I can interpret the photographs, and by comparing the aerial photography with the LiDAR, you can get an idea of what kind of features are still preserved in the landscape today. Next example, one of my favorite places in the Ypres is the provincial domain, the Palingbek. It's one of the outposts of the Ypres, the Flanders Fields Museum. There's a movie and a small pavilion where you can get some information about this site. And here you can see a British aerial photograph of 1917, May 1917. German front line is indicated in red, British front line in blue. The front line crosses the canal. You can see the ruins of a castle. Over here, you can see spoil heaps. So this canal was being dug. The earth that comes from the digging of this canal was as a spoil heap pushed aside. And these were a strategic height in the Ypres Salient, where there was a very heavy underground fighting going on. You can see mine craters in the distance in the no man's land. Looking again at the aerial photograph, present day situation, we strip away the trees. Suddenly we can see a conflict landscape below the tree canopy. We can see the canal over here. And then, interestingly, we can see this huge mine crater over here. Anybody that looks at the scale knows that the distance between the 4 and the 5, it's 100 meters. So it's almost a 100-meter wide scar of the First World War. Same here, these are all mine craters of the First World War. And then these look like mine craters. They're not mine craters, they're German artillery dumps of the Second World War. They knew that place from 20 years earlier. They reused it during the Second World War, and that spot was used to detonate ammunition. And so you have this mixture of World War I and World War II conflict at the same spot. Last example, to show you that LiDAR not only works in forested regions. You're looking at the grassland. You can look for the trench, but you won't find them. You need LiDAR to find them. If you look very carefully, you can see this trace over here. It's a zigzag trace of a Belgian communication trench. It's probably 1 or 2 meters shallow, preserved. And if you look at the aerial photograph, again, we have a very good match. And by combining this information, we can get more insight into what's going on, what might be preserved. So I've given you an example that with the aerial photography, we can get an idea of the historical war landscape. And by using archaeological perspection, we can know what is preserved today and how these tie up. And the final goal of the research is to the final message that I always give to fellow researchers: go for the integrated approach, not use one technique, use several techniques. And by doing so with the aerophotographs and the archaeological prospection, we have very powerful tools to research this landscape. And then second part, I will go more quickly through this because my time is running out and my voice is lowering down. I will quickly show you what's visible in the Flanders Fields Museum. One of the baselines of the Flanders Fields Museum, where I also work, is the concept of the landscape as the last witness. And it's a very important concept because now that the younger generations are visiting the museum, because the older generations has all passed away, there's no longer a generation that lived through the war that still comes to the museum. If you want to get into touch with the First World War, you have to do it through the landscape, through the heritage, and you can't do it anymore through the person. So that's why we consider the landscape as the last witness, the last living witness of the First World War. We have a museum application. It's in the end of the museum. You will recognize it. You will go to the museum, I think, and I hope, and you should. So you will see it over there. It's 4 large multi-touch screens. The interface is on top of it. It's called the Flanders Earth application. It gives you an insight into the present-day landscape with historical aerophotographs on top of it. So I have several layers of information: the modern-day landscape, the historical photograph, and then we have hotspots. Those are small stories which are being told. So we use aerophotographs to tell the story of a specific place. Visitors can go to a spot, they can go to the village of Stichelbaut, they can change the transparency, and suddenly the green fields become scarred with the traces of the First World War. And this was something that was developed for the Flanders Fields Museum. And last year, we developed the website www.1914-1918.be. It's a German language. It's a multilingual website, but it's also in German. And it's a website in where you can where you can consult 3,500 of our aerophotographs. So every part of West Flanders is covered. Any spot that you can or will visit in the landscape in the next coming days, you can look for that spot on the website, and you can have an idea of what was going on on the ground. So you can make that comparison yourself. And then finally, we are a museum that also, well, I've already told it that the landscape is very important to us. So we also not only bring the landscape in the museum walls, but we also bring museum techniques to the landscape. It doesn't take too much imagination to think of the combination between the aerophotograph, the present-day landscape. Think of a tablet PC with GPS on board of it, and you can do a walk. That's something that is not science fiction. That's something we have done. When you go to the Play Store and the App Store, you can download applications for smartphone and also for iPad. They're called Hypersalient. We have a whole bunch of them. We have 4 different apps. But if you Google for Hypersalient in the App Store, you will find them. And it's a guided tour that you can do by walking in the app. The app has a combination of points of information. The idea is that you walk in the landscape, so your blue dot is changing. You are walking, you get to a hotspot, you get to the German front line, a place called Fortin-17. You get information about an archaeological excavation that went there. You can change the transparency, so you have an idea of, if you're standing in this spot, you're standing on the German front line. It's no longer visible today, but by using the application, you can stand on the German front line, you can cross no man's land, and you can come to the Allied front line. You can really live in real time, feel and see how close the lines were located, and you can see how densely covered this landscape was with trenches. This was my last slide, the question slide. I haven't seen any questions in the, I've seen the website now. If anybody has questions, then shoot, I would say.